Welcome, everyone. Glad you could join us today for our 1-hour webinar, Duplicate Payments, How to Protect Against This Growing Problem. I'm Susan Plain, part of the marketing team here at MHC. I'm excited to introduce our speaker, Mary Schaeffer. As you may know, Mary is the founder of AP Now and is a nationally recognized accounts payable and payments expert. She's the author of 20 business books, including 127 best practices for accounts payable, and is the host of AP Now podcast and YouTube channel. In addition to welcoming Mary, I'd like to go over some housekeeping items. This webinar is being recorded. All participants will be muted to prevent background noise. During the webinar, please use the Q&A section to type in any questions you may have. The recording of the live webinar will be emailed to you and available on mhcautomation.com for future reference. Please complete the post-webinar survey at the end. We really appreciate your feedback. Now it's time to hand off the presentation to our speaker, Mary.
Thanks, Susan, and thanks, MHC, for inviting me. And of course, thanks everyone for coming to hear me talk. This is a topic that I'm very passionate about. I feel strongly about because let's face it, we all want to hold on to as much of our money as possible, and paying someone twice or for something erroneous or extra charges doesn't help with that goal, if you will. So I like to start sometimes with one of my favorite Chinese proverb, depending upon how you look at things. May you live in interesting times. This is sometimes also known as the Chamberlain curse, in case you were interested in that. And Lord knows for the last few years, we've had interesting times, if you will. We've seen a lot of change. A lot of it, we probably wouldn't have done unless we were forced to do, but it's brought about some good changes and some bad changes, to be fair. I like to say with technology, it gives with one hand and it takes with the other. Of course, technology has made it easier for some crooks to take advantage. It's also made it easier to make duplicate payments when you start looking at things like invoices being emailed more than once. But it also helps us, and it helps us a lot to weed out these duplicates. So let's dive right in now, and I'll stop eulogizing about this. We're going to start off by talking about some background information. We're going to talk about why there's been an increase in duplicate payments, and there has been. I've talked to a number of professionals in the field and a number of folks just like yourself. So we're going to talk about why there has been this increase. And unfortunately, just as an aside, not everybody has identified these duplicates. We're going to talk about what happens to duplicate payments when they occur. Many of us have made duplicate payments ourselves. I know I have. Sometimes I'll pay an electric bill twice, a utility bill, maybe the phone bill, or a credit card bill. I do it about once every 2 years. And what happens in those cases is the credit card company or the utility is very nice. They give me a credit on my next bill and I see it there, and then I get my money back, so to speak. I want to make it really clear. This does not happen in the business world. It does not happen in the corporate world. Yeah, it will happen on your utility bill, but it will not happen on 99.9% of your other bills, your other invoices. So we need to take an aggressive and positive approach towards this problem. We'll talk a little bit about how it hurts. And we're also going to talk about some questionable vendor practices that will lead you to make a duplicate payment, not on purpose, of course. Then we're going to go in and we're going to talk about what you can do to make sure this doesn't happen, so that you don't make a duplicate payment, so that you can protect your organization and protect your organization's bottom line. We're going to talk about sticking your head in the sand, because I got to tell you, I run into people who do this. I don't want to say all the time, because that's overstating it, but there's a good portion of the population who believes they don't make duplicate payments. And then at the end, just for a very tiny bit, we're going to talk about how automation can help with this ongoing problem. So MHC and Susan, we've got our first poll now.
Great. I'm launching our first poll question here. We'd like to know, what is your biggest invoice problem? So I'll give you some time to answer our poll question here.
Okay.
I see some answers coming in.
Okay.
And I'll give a couple more seconds here and I will end our poll and then share the results. We're still
Okay.
shifting around here, so I want to give a
Yeah.
little more time. So looks like we've ended here.
Okay. So,
So I'm going to share our results. We
okay.
have a high percentage, 55% duplicate copies of the same invoice coming through as the top leader.
And Susan, not only do we have 55% saying that, we've got another almost 20% who are saying all of the above. So that means that 3/4 of our audience today has a problem with vendors sending duplicate copies of the same invoice. And that's high, okay? But it's kind of in line with what I see from the rest of my audience, if you will, accounts payable and accounting professionals. So a huge problem. It's a problem that we always dealt with, but not to the extent that we're dealing with it now, thanks to email and how inexpensive email is. Okay. Okay, we're going to move right on now and talk about, do we need to close the poll?
Yeah, we should be able to just go to the next slide, Mary.
Okay, and we can't. Let me just see something. Okay, here we go. So one of the points that I like to make about duplicate payments is that anything that you do to stop duplicate payments or to guard against it will also help you guard against fraud. So I like to say, you get double bang for your buck. You do something to rein in duplicate payments. At the same time, you are probably reining in fraud. You're making it a little bit more difficult for fraudsters to defraud your company. Now, you saw on the previous slide that 75% of you basically had a problem with dealing with duplicate copies of invoices. Now, clearly not all your vendors send duplicate copies of invoices, but a lot of them do. And what our statistics show, and this is not a precise number, but it's a kind of a ballpark number, is that companies are getting about 25% of all invoices sent twice. So, if you weed them out, that's fine, except, and keep this in mind, that it takes time and effort to weed out those duplicate copies of invoices. And I don't know about your organization, but most organizations that I talk to, they don't have a whole lot of people working in accounts payable and extra staff, twiddling their thumbs. So identifying these duplicate invoices is important. And the earlier you can do it in the process, the more effective and efficient your accounts payable function will be. And of course, the duplicate copies of invoices are due to mainly the cheap cost, low cost of email. Some are still emailing and mailing, but the low cost of email makes it an efficient practice if you're in collections. So you're going to hear me say later on that when you find vendors who do this, that we recommend that you talk to them. And there are some techniques that we have that you can use, but realize they're probably not going to stop. This problem is not going away. It's one that we're going to have to deal with on an ongoing basis. It's like saying fraudsters are going to go away. Probably not. Okay, so we're going to move right in and we're going to go through some of the background material that I want to cover with regards to duplicate payments. So I've alluded to, or actually come right out and said that we've seen an increase in duplicate payments. And you might step back and say, well, why is this? Why is this happening? And I call it the COVID craziness. You probably remember just about 2 years ago, many organizations went home. They took their accounts payable function remote on the flip of a switch. It happened literally overnight. I know one woman who said she got a text from her company telling her, she was accounts payable director, that everybody was going to have to work from home starting the next day. So they didn't even have time to bring computers home, etc. So when that happened, two things happened. Obviously, the AP function went home, but that also meant there was nobody in the office to pick up invoices. So invoices that were being mailed, those folks now had to turn around, and were turning around and emailing it. And eventually that mail did get picked up. So there was a spike in duplicate payments. Around that time, as we were going through this, I got a number of calls from readers, members, people who are members of either AP Now or read our stuff or watch our YouTube videos, whatever. And the calls all were, hey, we don't have an ACH program. How can we set one up? We've got to get one set up. This is to make electronic payments. And, that's great that there was finally this interest in electronic payments. I'm a big advocate of paying your vendors via ACH. The problem was this was not the ideal time to set up a program, given everything that was going on. But people started to see the light, and we have seen a move towards more ACH payments. And friendly with one of the guys over at Nacha, and he tells me, yes, there has been a big spike in electronic payments. The U.S. Post Office has also said that the U.S. mail will be slower. Okay, it's just a fact of life, of things that the post office is going through. That means it's going to take longer to get those invoices by email, and it's going to take longer for your check or your if you're mailing it, your check to get to the vendor. And if the check is not there by the due date, the vendor is going to turn around and send another invoice. And to be perfectly honest, they're within their rights to send a second invoice if you haven't paid on time. So there's going to be that, and that's going to continue to add to the reason why this problem of duplicate invoices is never going to go completely away. And then, of course, there is the proliferation of email and emailed invoices, and it's so cheap. It's a really good mechanism for accounts receivable folks and collection people who are trying to collect on unpaid invoices. Okay, so 75% of you had that problem, and now hopefully you can understand a little bit why. And we've got our next poll.
Yeah, our next poll here is in regards to remote work. I'm going to launch this question.
Oh, this is one of my favorite questions, and I've been asking it now, Susan, for 2 years, because it seems like we're always in a position where people think we're going to go back to the office in a few weeks or a few months.
All right, I have some still getting responses in, fluctuating quite a bit.
Yep.
So just give a couple more seconds here. Looks like we got our responses.
Yep.
Gonna end the poll and then share our results and take a look at what we have.
So you can see here that only about a third of all the respondents are in the office all the time. The rest of the audience is working remotely, some or all of the time. Okay, and this kind of is what we expect for the new norm. And just an interesting aside, this has always been a topic that I found fascinating. So I've done surveys on it for years. Okay, and usually the answer was very few or no one was working remotely. And right before COVID hit, I happened to do a seminar, and we got talking about this, and a number of people were allowing it. And at that time, we did a quick poll, and about 20% of the companies were allowing people to work remotely one day a week or one day a month, but it was a big benefit. Okay, and only, as I said, a small number. You can see how that's changed. Okay, and I now realized I have to close the poll to move on. So interesting, how the market's changed, and we have to change our policies and procedures to do that. Weeding out them. Okay, so our stats regarding duplicate invoices: 25% are duplicates, and they are sent in several ways. They're either emailed to several parties, and sometimes, by the way, it is the fault of somebody within your organization that you're getting those duplicate invoices, because you may have told your vendors, hey, send all the invoices to accounts payable, and you've told them where to do it. And meanwhile, someone in purchasing says, hey, can you send it to me at the same time? And so the vendor doesn't care, and they go ahead and send it to everybody who asks. And so even when you talk to the vendor, the supplier, they're still going to do it because their favorite person in purchasing asked them. Even before COVID, there was this problem of people who emailed and mailed the invoices, but this has been amplified during COVID, especially with people who were only mailing invoices prior to the beginning of COVID. So by the way, that's another little tip of where to look for potential duplicates. If you have somebody who was mailing and now started emailing, you might want to go back and review their files to make sure that you're only paying once. So again, you need to weed them out. It takes time and effort. It takes time and effort from your staff when they could be doing more value added tasks, but it's important because it's real money out of your pocket. So if you don't address this problem, your accounts payable function is going to become less efficient than it could, simply because your people are spending all their time focused on this non-value added task. Okay, so what happens with duplicate payments? So most of the time they're not returned, and I'm going to go into more detail about what happens when they're not returned. But sometimes you'll have a vendor who is, I want to say, honorable or malicious, and you'll see why I say that. And I call it the tale of two outcomes. Sometimes the vendor will, especially if that duplicate payment was a check, they'll just take the check and they'll return it to somebody in accounts payable, and then you can void it and take it off your positive pay file, document it when you do that so that the records are okay and you don't make a duplicate payment. I want to caution you that when you do that, when you void the check, you want to keep good records, because if you don't, and the unclaimed property auditors come in and ask about it, and you can't figure out why you voided that check, then they may claim it's unclaimed property, and you can have a whole big mess on that hand. So void it, but document it so you'll remember, because they won't come in for a few years and then you'll have forgotten. Okay, so the second outcome that could happen, and this happened at a company that I worked for. The only thing that I can say about this story is thank God I wasn't directly involved. But the company made a duplicate payment. I'm sure, by the way, they made many of them because our processes were less than ideal, and let's just leave it at that. But anyway, they made a duplicate payment and they made it to a supplier who was difficult. Let's just leave it at that. And so one of the executives from the supplier came in to see the chief operating officer of the company. And while he was in the meeting, which I believe was for other purposes, he pulled the check, the duplicate payment out, and he threw it on the chief operating officer's desk. And he said, "Glad to see you guys have so much money that you can afford to make payments twice." So, our COO kind of had to grit his teeth and, say, "Thank you for returning the money," or something like that. And, not say what was really going through his mind. And of course, after the supplier left, he came down, and it was not a pretty day when he brought the payment back to the accounts payable department, and they had to try and figure out what had happened, which is another tip, by the way. When you do make a duplicate payment and you find it, you want to do research to figure out what happened. Why did we make that payment? And once you figure it out, then you want to go back and close the loophole that allowed that duplicate payment to occur. Because, it's one thing to make the mistake. It's another thing to repeat it. And that's the last thing that you want to do. Okay, so that's the ugly the ugly side of what can happen. But what many companies will do is they will issue a vendor credit. And so the idea with issuing a vendor credit is they issue the credit, it goes on your account, and then you use that amount of money to reduce your payment on future invoices. This sometimes can lead to an audit trail issue, but if you document everything really well, then it's fine. Now, what happens with the vendor credits? So when the vendor issues a credit, it also it should send a notification. They don't always send the notification, but it should send the notification, and the notification will either go to the purchasing department, who will forward it on to accounts payable, hopefully. Sometimes they send it to the purchasing department and they've done their share, and the accounts payable department doesn't get it because purchasing either never forwarded it or didn't know what to do with it or whatever. So the bad is that the vendor issues the credit. They send it to the company. The company gets it, and then they put the person in accounts payable, the processor doesn't recognize it as a vendor credit. They think it's an invoice and they pay it. So while you maybe had a credit for $100, now you'll have a credit for $200 because somebody paid it. So what you need to do in this instance is simply train your staff so that they know how to deal. They know how to A, recognize vendor credits, and B, deal with them. The ugly, there can be two sides to the ugly, okay? The ugly, number one, they issue the vendor credit, they put it on their books, and they don't tell you. What's more is if you request a statement showing all open activity, they suppress the printing, the inclusion of the vendor credits on that statement. Now, you're saying, would they actually do that? I had a controller send me a note one time, and she said, I was getting ready to tell you that you're ridiculous when you say that vendors suppress credits when they send out statements, she said, but then I realized our ERP system had functionality to print statements without showing open vendor credits. And she said, and I realized the reason this functionality is in there is that companies want to produce statements without showing vendor credit. So that's kind of ugly. They're giving you that money and then they're not telling you about it. When a vendor credit is on the vendor's books, regardless of whether they tried to hide it from you or they sent it to you and you didn't use it because you didn't get it or you didn't know, whatever the reason is, when the credits stay on the vendors' books for a while, at the end of a quarter or the end of a fiscal year, what will happen in many organizations is the accounts receivable person will go through their books and try and clean them up, if you will. And so they'll see a vendor credit, which you haven't taken, and let's say it's 6 months old. And then they'll also see that maybe you took an unauthorized deduction or a deduction they didn't agree with, or you had an unauthorized, you took an early payment discount after the discount date, so it's an unauthorized early payment discount. Or something of that nature, and they didn't fight with you about it, but it's showing on their books as a short payment for whatever reason. They'll use those vendor credits to wash out those short payments. Everybody will be happy. Everybody will think they got what they wanted, but in actuality, you did not get the money that you were owed. So no, it wasn't, so that's what can happen with vendor credits if you don't investigate them, you don't follow up, and you don't take them soon enough. So why duplicate payments hurt? The obvious answer is that it comes off the bottom line. If you paid $100 that you shouldn't, your company is now $100 less profitable than it should be. But there's more. It costs more than that. We all have to have routines where we go in and analyze our payments to make sure we didn't make a duplicate payment. This takes time and it takes effort. And time and effort, in effect, cost money. Or you might hire an outside audit firm. Now, an outside audit firm will charge you a fee. Typically, you want to hire one that works on a contingency basis, but still, you're not getting 100% of your money back. So whether you're paying for it in terms of staff time, paying your staff to do this or audit, or paying an outside firm to do it, there is a cost associated with it, and that comes off the bottom line. The last one is probably, to my mind, the biggest risk, if you will. And that is, I like to say sometimes a fraud starts with an honest mistake. So, for example, you pay somebody twice when you shouldn't have, and it was an honest mistake. Maybe your payment got lost in the mail or it was late or whatever. They sent a second invoice and you paid it. And at that point in time, when they get that second payment, a light goes off at the vendor, and the vendor thinks, these folks don't have such good procedures in place. They don't know exactly what they're doing. If I bill them twice, maybe they'll pay me twice. And so they start billing you twice, hoping to trick you into making that duplicate payment. So while it didn't occur to them before, when they did get this duplicate payment, not only did they not return it, which was costly enough, but they also started to rev up their practice is doing whatever it was that caused you to make that payment. Another reason, so that whenever you discover a duplicate payment, go back, review what happened, review where you had the gap, if you will, that allowed this duplicate payment to be made, and then fix it. And you want to do it, as quickly as possible. So I said at the beginning that sometimes you'll have vendors who will play games and do things that to try and get you to pay twice. Now, I'm going to talk about some of these practices. You're going to say, especially the first one, that the reason for that may be not that the vendor is, squirmy or questionable. It's just their practice. And I'm going to agree with you on that. But some of the practices, as you'll see, are designed to force you to hopefully make a mistake. So the first one, and you've probably all seen this a million times, is when the vendor changes the invoice number on the second invoice. Now, the way most companies do this is if you had invoice number 12345, the second invoice or the copy of the invoice comes in with invoice number 12345A. And then if they send a third copy, it'll be 12345B. Now, this is when they send a second copy of the invoice at a different date, not when they send them all at once. So if they send it to you in AP, somebody in purchasing, maybe covering their bases, send it to the controller, who knows what they do. And the reason that we focus on this so much is one of the primary ways, or at least the first way that people identify duplicate invoices is focused on the invoice number, okay? So be aware that they may change the invoice number on the second date. A few vendors, and I've never heard a good explanation for this. I've heard explanations, but not good explanations, will completely change the invoice number. So while you may be able to find out that 12345 is the same as invoice number 12345A, it's not so easy to figure out that invoice 12345 is the same as invoice number 56789. Okay, that's just a little bit more difficult. The next practice, and this is being recommended by some consultants who, I want to say that the goal of this is less than honorable. I'm sorry, you're not going to convince me otherwise. And what they are recommending to their clients is that they send a second invoice on or near the due date. So if your invoice is due, if the payment is due on May 1st, on April 28th, and on May 1st, they'll send a second copy of the invoice. The idea is to remind you. There's not a good explanation in my mind. Okay, and the last item, and I want you to be very wary of, is that what I call screaming vendors. And these are vendors who call up and rant and rave and berate your staff and accounts payable to get them to make a payment quick. And of course, they'll claim that they've not been paid already. Now, if you're paying late, if your practices are less than ideal, there's a chance that they're legitimate, especially if they're a small vendor and you're a big player in the market and you're doing some sort of payment timing mechanism where you're paying everybody 5 days, 15 days, 30 days late. And if they're a small vendor and they're dependent on that payment to make payroll, then you can understand why they're pushed to the wall. But oftentimes that's not the case. And I have a story I'm going to share with you, mainly because I find it very amusing. And the accounts payable person came out on top. So I was a director of AP at a company that had a really good AP practices, and they paid people on time. And she came across one of the processors crying at her desk. And of course, this is just what everybody wants, a staffer crying at their desk. Anyway, she said, "What's happened?" And she said, she just got off the phone with consultant, whatever his name was, and he had berated her. And he said it would be easier to get a rooster to lay an egg on a picket fence in New York City in July than it would be to get a payment out of this company on time. And, she knew their practices were good, and she saw stars. And the processors also shared that this happened every month with his monthly invoices. So she told the processor, get your pull that guy's file. So they pulled the file for that vendor, and what they discovered was that he had been paid twice every month for the last 18 months. So they called the manager who was involved, who had hired him. They showed him everything. That manager called the consultant and said he wanted to come in. I wanted him to come in and talk about payments. You think the guy would have been bright enough to dodge that bullet, but he said no. He said, good, I want to come in. I'm always having trouble getting paid. And of course, they presented him with the information and they fired him. Now, this company was lucky. Of course, they were a big company. They got all the money, all the duplicate payments back. Not everybody is so lucky. So when a vendor is screaming, you want to take a look at why they're screaming. Are they legitimate? But don't automatically fold, okay? Because they may be playing games. Now, I'm going to talk about best practices. Most of the time, most of the best practices that I'm about to talk with don't cost anything. So there's no real excuse for doing them. It's like dieting or, exercising. Maybe they're not fun, but there's no real excuse for not doing them. Now, one of the ones that we hear when we talk about segregation of duties is that companies will set up the absolute perfect separation of duties protocols. They'll be doing everything exactly right. And then they'll say, well, there's one exception. And I'll say, okay, well, what's that exception? And they typically tell me it's usually the AP manager or the controller, and they have access to everything. And when I ask, I'll say, well, why is that? And they'll say, well, this way they can help out at the end of the month when we have a backlog of invoices to be entered, or they can chip in when somebody's out sick, or they can do training. And all of these are legitimate business reasons, but they don't trump not appropriate segregation of duties. Appropriate separation of duties trumps everything, because otherwise you open yourself up to a lot of practices, including the possibility of fraud. So you should be using appropriate and strong internal controls across your whole accounts payable, procure to pay, treasury, accounting functions, no exceptions, no matter how good the explanation is, as even as I just described, okay? Getting the work done is important, but not paying people twice and not allowing fraud in is even more important. And sometimes people will say, oh, Johnny or Jane, they never take a vacation. They're dedicated to this company. They would never do anything like that. And you should know from statistics from the certified fraud examiner, most internal fraud is committed by long-term trusted employees who everyone thought up until the point that the fraud was discovered that these people would never do anything to harm the company. Another sign is that if somebody never takes a vacation, yes, maybe they are dedicated. They probably are, but you want to mandate every person who has anything to do with your money, accounting, accounts payable, treasury, audit, anyone who has the ability to touch your money in any way takes 5 consecutive days off. And during that time off, someone else does their job. They don't do it from home. Now, you want to standardize your processes so that everybody does things exactly the same way. And what this means then is if you get an invoice and you process it today, and I get that same invoice and I process it tomorrow, it will be very easy for me to identify it. This means that we also need to give our staff regular training, adequate training, better to overtrain than to undertrain. And anytime there is an upgrade, you want to have more training. Now, you hate to be like this, but this is one of those areas where it's do it the way I tell you to do, not the creative way that you think is better. If you have a creative way, if one of your staffers has a creative way to do things better, then you want them to share it with you. And if it truly is better, and it might be, because sometimes people who are closest to the function are the ones who are best able to understand it and know where the advances should come. But if they do have a better way, then let's have everybody use it, not just one person. So you want to not be creative until they share it, and standardize. Standardize means centralized receipting of invoices, and this should be one postal address. And that postal address, by the way, should be very specific. So it should not just be 100 Main Street, for example. It should be ABC Company, 100 Main Street, Attention Accounts Payable Department, or ABC Company, 100 Main Street, second floor, or a separate PO box. But you want to have the receipt. You want to get your hands on those invoices as quickly as possible. So very specific postal address. You also want to set up a fax number for those people who still want to fax invoices. There are a few of them, more than you might think. And ideally, you want to marry that fax number to a e-fax facility so that you can have that fax turned into an electronic document, and then it can be emailed, and then it can be processed as you would any mailed invoice, including the possibility of having it read automatically into an automation solution. And you want to have one email address. The email address you want to use is something like invoices at ABC Company, AP at ABC Company. You don't want it going to individual people. If it goes to individual people, then you stand the problem of them leaving, them being unexpectedly on vacation, and no one being able to access that email account. Okay, our next poll number 3.
Yes, we are going to be asking you the percentage of your vendors. Which ones are sending those duplicates prior to the due date? So,
oh, I'm really curious in this, Susan.
quite a bit of fluctuation yet.
Yes, but Susan, I'm looking and I see 25%, 31% are saying less than 5%.
I'm gonna end the poll here and share it with everybody.
Okay, so you can see 30% are saying less than 5%, almost 10%, 8% are saying approximately a quarter. What's interesting is people are saying between 25 and 50%. That is horrific, and it's a horrific amount of extra work. That it adds value, and I hate to say it's a non-value added task, because it adds value if you weed them out and you don't make a duplicate payment, but it's work that you don't have to really do, or you shouldn't have to do. Let me put it that way. You shouldn't. So what do you want to do? Okay, first of all, you want to contact the vendors who are sending them and ask them to stop. Now, some of them will and some of them won't. I was at a credit conference. Had gotten invited to do a talk there, and somehow this issue came up. And I ended up talking with one credit manager, and I said to her something about, if you keep sending these duplicate copies of invoices, which she freely admitted they did, it's going to make the AP staff at your customer less efficient, and it could possibly delay your payment. She stood there and she folded her arms and she kind of frowned at me. And what she didn't say, because I guess she was polite, was, I don't care if it creates extra work for them. We just want to get paid. So realize that even if they say they're going to stop doing it, they may not. If the problem gets bad with certain people, you've talked to them a few times, you might warn them that they are going to go on what I call an act list, an always check thoroughly list. And these are vendors whose payments get held for a day or two while you duplicate check to make sure that they haven't invoiced you already and you haven't paid it, and so that it could delay payments. Again, before you do this, I would make sure management was on track with that, because they may not appreciate you doing that. And of course, if you do that, be very polite, even though you're ready to wring their necks for all the extra work they created, but whatever. Okay, the next thing, and by the way, this is your best way to eliminate duplicates and identify them early on, is to create a rigid coding standard for data entry. The data entry, whether it's going into the master vendor file when you're first setting up a vendor, or it is for processing invoices. And this coding standard should address a whole bunch of things like how a name is entered, how you use punctuation, how you enter invoice numbers, etc., and be very detailed about it. And you want to tell people that they must use this coding standard, and then you want to track them, because once they start playing around, duplicate payments can occur very easily. So let me give you a simple example. Let's say you have a contractor, Mary Schaeffer, I'm going to pick on myself. If an invoice comes in and it's entered as Mary Schaeffer, that is going to look very different than an invoice that's coded in as Schaeffer, Mary. Okay, so something as simple as that is going to cause problems. So make sure your coding standard is quite precise. I one time had a director of AP from a bank where they had, a ton of activity, tell me they had reduced their duplicate payments from $2 million a year to something like $60,000 a year simply by doing that. Okay, vendor credits I've talked about, but let's just go over it one more time. Make sure your processing staff recognizes what a vendor credit is, what they look like, and what they should be doing with them. And this is not just for your existing staff, but your new staff. You want to make sure when you hire a new employee that they understand. A lot of them will, to be perfectly honest, but you want to make sure you hit those that don't. And then you want to go over with them what to do with the credit, just in case they don't know. Now, I understand if you're working in accounts payable, this is beyond your control. But if you pay people on time, they don't have a legitimate reason for sending another copy of their invoice. And if the due date comes and goes and they haven't been paid, they are within their rights to send another copy of the invoice. And as you probably learned the hard way, most of them will. So as much as you can, pay people on time. And that will hopefully eliminate some of those duplicate copies of invoices. Okay, so now, don't stick your head in the sand about this. I've heard more than one person say, I don't want to say it's a preponderance, but it's not. But I've heard somewhere between 10 and 20% of companies out there, especially when you talk to like controllers, they'll say things like, oh, we use best practices. We never make a duplicate payment. And, when I hear people say that, I think to myself, yeah, that's like saying you never make a mistake. From my lips to God's ears. Everybody will make a duplicate payment at some point. So, accept that. And if you make like 3 duplicate payments a year, that's phenomenal. Your staff is doing a phenomenal job. And, everybody deserves a pat on the back. But even going back to my example of the bank where, they went from 2 million to, I don't know, $60,000, there was still some duplicates because no one's perfect. People make keying errors all the time. And you have devious vendors out there who are trying to play games. Not a lot of them, but some of them. So realize that they happen and you need to take steps to find them and eliminate them. And those duplicate invoices, which are growing as we speak, are part of are a big culprit. And the next one, our vendors are honorable and they'll return on duplicate payments. Well, most of your vendors probably are honorable. Whether they return them or not is another question. To be fair, and this might sound callous, but it is what it is. When you make a duplicate payment, in order for it to be recognized as a duplicate payment and a credit put on your book, the person who's doing cash application has to research it. And not for nothing, but researching your duplicate payments is very low on their scale, on their priority scale. They're more interested in getting the payments applied as best they can for the ones that they know. So yes, the vendors may return it. They may return it in the form of a vendor credit. In fact, that's how most of them will return it. But then, as we discussed earlier, there's a lot of problems with vendor credits, not only getting them, but how they're handled once you get them, because sometimes staff doesn't know what to do or they get lost in the shuffle. So one other time, and if you've had any of these situations, then I want you to think about it and perhaps go back and do some extra checking. But there are times when a company is more apt to make duplicate payments, and that is any time of change or unrest, which is why I'm very interested to see what happened with regards to duplicate payments 2 years ago when that data starts to come out. Because for many, they don't do a duplicate payment audit until a year or many 2 years after the fact. So it takes a while. It'll take a while for the COVID related stuff to start to show up. But if you have any of the following things, then you want to take a look at your duplicate payments or the potential. You want to analyze for potential duplicate payments that might have occurred during a time when you were doing a system upgrade. A newer ERP, when you're putting in a new ERP system, if you make a change, these first two, the invoice could be handled under one ERP system and then under the other, and it won't show up. It's not easily identifiable. So you want to do some extra analysis around those times. Anytime you get new technology. So for example, if you start with an automation solution, you want to make sure that you do a little checking over the crossover period. And of course, when you add new staff, you won't know exactly, what their capabilities are. For example, do they understand, do they recognize vendor credits, etc. So all these change or unrest, they may be all for the good in the long run, but in the short run, you could potentially make more duplicate payments. So you've heard me discuss audits. I know a lot of people don't like third-party audits. They think they're expensive, and they are, or they're not, but it's more expensive not to do one. But I also want to talk about self-audits. Depending upon the capability of your staff and the amount of staff that you have, you'll be able to do some or all of this, but at a very minimum, I highly recommend that you start off with a statement audit. And what this means is that you request all your vendors to send you statements of all open activity. Remember, you want to make a big deal about getting open activity, not just open invoices. They're happy to tell you about the open invoices. And then you want to recover any credits that you find on them. Why do I make such a big deal about it? Because I don't think they're that hard to do, the statement audits. And if you hire a third-party firm, the first thing that they're going to do is a statement audit. They're going to request statements from all your suppliers. So that's kind of the low-hanging fruit. So why not go after that low-hanging fruit yourself? So you want to do the statement audits. You also might develop some analytical checking yourself using Excel or some other analytical tools. Conditional formatting is one of my favorites because it's easy to use to look for duplicates. You can just dump all your data into Excel, and then you can, using conditional formatting, you can look for duplicate invoice numbers, duplicate payment amounts, and then do the research. Now, especially on duplicate payment amounts, because just because two payments are for the same amount, it doesn't mean it's a duplicate payment. It may be that it was a monthly payment, like let's say your rent, or it may just be that two different vendors got paid the same amount of money, and that's how things worked out, and that was that. Pivot tables, etc. I talked about third-party audits. They start with the statement audit, so you should too. If you get a third-party audit, especially if you think that you're one of those companies who never makes a duplicate payment, make sure you get one that works on a contingency fee basis. And then if you do, you're good as gold. And lastly, you want to get from them a management report, which they should give you which details your operations and where you need to make improvements to reduce the amount of duplicate payments that you have. That's like getting a free consultant, somebody to look at your operations with a different set of eyes. Now, I haven't talked about it much, but hopefully you've picked up. Automation is great for weeding out duplicates. And it does it fast and cheap and easier than people. Your automation solution won't make coding errors, and it can analyze all your data, while many of us are limited by their time and resources and will only look at part of it. And best of all, it frees up your people to work on more value-added tasks. And God knows most companies have enough of those tasks. So let's have our last poll, and then I think there are a few questions.
Our last poll for the day is here. Do you have an active upcoming AP initiative? So looking to see if you have an active or upcoming AP initiative. Looks like we have our numbers in. I'm going to end the poll here.
Great. And it looks like about 2/3 of you do, which is great, because that means you're all processing and improving initiatives. Now, I know I see some questions in the question box, but I think first we just want to have a quick introduction to North Star.
Sure. Thank you for your exceptional presentation, Mary. I'd like to just take a minute to explain how MHC North Star has the capabilities needed to support and resolve the duplicate payments. We prevent duplicate payments by doing an upfront duplicate invoice detection and have a double layer of security, as we also do duplicate payment checks. MHC North Star helps customers prevent costly mistakes, eliminate wasted effort, and avoid the risks of fraud with its duplicate invoice and payment detection functionality, which is powered by AI. And then next, let's get started with a few of the questions that came in throughout the presentation.
Okay, I'm all ears.
Okay, let's start out with a few here. Let me get these in order here. Looks like, what can I do if a vendor with an outstanding credit refuses to return the funds, insisting instead that we spend the money with them? So
the first time I heard that question, and I've heard it several times, it made my hair stand up. It's really slimy vendor practice. First of all, that's your money. Okay, you are entitled to it. They need to give it back to you, and they need to give it back to you however you want it. If you want to take it as a credit against a future invoice, that's fine. But if you've decided not to do business with them, or not to place an order for, the next 6 months for whatever your business needs are, then they need to give you that money back. If they don't, escalate the request. Take it to your boss and let your boss go to someone at his or her level. And if that doesn't work, escalate it again and again. But that's thievery. Not that I'm too opinionated or anything.
Great advice, Mary. Next question. My boss says that third-party recovery audit firms charge too much. Do you agree? And if not, how can I change his mind?
Okay, so the answer to that is no, I don't agree. And I want to give you, I call it my $1 million example. So let's say, and I like to make numbers easy because I can do the math in my head. Let's say the audit firm is charging a recovery fee of 25%. They discover $1 million worth of duplicate payments. You have to pay them $250,000. Your boss is lying on the floor screaming, kicking and screaming. But the answer to that is, if you don't hire that audit firm, what is it going to cost your company? And I'll give you, a few seconds to think about it. But I know we've got, I want to get to all the questions. So the answer to that is, it costs your company $750,000 not to do the recovery audit. Because if you do it, $1 million less the 250, you get 750. If you don't do it, you get nothing.
Makes sense. I like that $1 million.
You like that?
Here we go. When entering names in the vendor file or for invoice processing, which is better? First name, last name, or last name, first name?
So the answer to that is either, as long as you're consistent. Consistent and having everybody do it the same is the overriding principle. Personally, I'm going to tell you, I like last name, comma, first name for the simple reason. Sometimes people will send in the invoice using their nickname. So let me give you the example, Robert, and the nickname for that might be Bob. So if they go in first name, last name, it would go in Robert last name. And then the second one would go in Bob last name. And it would not be close enough to determine, you wouldn't see where the duplicate was. But if it was the other way around, last name, comma, Robert, last name, comma, Bob, you might see it. So my preference is last name, comma, first name, but either way is fine as long as everybody does it the same.
Makes sense. Let's do one more question here. What can I do if someone in purchasing tells a supplier to send the invoice to them first and not to AP?
So sometimes you'll see vendors will tell suppliers that question, and this goes back to what your company policy is. And that would be one of those situations where I would get my boss involved. If the policy comes to AP first, you want to make that clear to the vendor. But again, with email, the vendor doesn't want to get into these fights with you, and they're going to send it to both. And I would just make a note, all of Joe's clients probably are getting a duplicate copy invoice to him, and track it that way.
Makes sense. Okay, that's all the questions we'll take for today. If you sent in a question that hasn't been answered yet, we'll follow up individually. Please remember to fill out the post-webinar survey, and feel free to contact Bridget at MHC for more information about duplicate payment solutions. And you, once again, will receive a recording of today's session via email. And there'll also be a little bonus where you're going to have access to a duplicate payment checklist. And I thank you for joining us today.
Thanks, everyone, and good luck.